found out my parents left everything to my brother in their will, so I stopped helping with their bills and extra expenses. A month later, Mom texted me, "The mortgage is due." No greeting, no small talk. I simply replied. I always believed in family, not just as a word, but as something sacred. My parents raised us with this ideal, that no matter what, family comes first. My older brother Jacob and I were close growing up, but as the years went by, things changed. He moved to another state, built his career, and rarely looked back. Meanwhile, I stayed nearby, helping Mom and Dad whenever they needed it. From mowing their lawn to paying for unexpected repairs, even covering part of their utility bills when times got tough, I stepped in without hesitation. I never kept a tab, because in my heart, I was doing what any loyal son would do. But I guess I always assumed that this commitment would be appreciated, maybe even reciprocated in some way down the line. That assumption crumbled the day I found out about their will. I wasn't snooping. My mother casually mentioned it during a conversation about estate planning. She said, "Well, you know Jacob will be taking care of things when we're gone." I didn't understand at first, but after a few clarifying questions, the truth hit hard. They had left everything to him. The house, the savings, even Dad's vintage car that we both adored growing up. It was all his. No split, no consideration. My name wasn't mentioned. I felt like someone had pulled the floor from beneath my feet. It wasn't about the money. It was the betrayal, the realization that all those years of stepping up meant nothing to them. I managed to keep a straight face during that call, but my heart was pounding. When I hung up, I sat there, stunned. My entire life, I thought I was doing right by them. And yet, they had made their choice without even discussing it with me. A part of me wanted to scream, but a colder, quieter part decided I would simply stop. Stop paying. Stop helping. Stop sacrificing my own stability for people who clearly didn't see me as an equal. It wasn't an emotional outburst. It was a calculated decision. I didn't even tell them. I just waited for the day they would notice. The silence stretched for a few weeks. I expected some kind of reaction, maybe a phone call asking why I hadn't dropped by, or a message about the electric bill, but nothing came. They must have assumed everything was business as usual. In that time, I began to reflect on all the little sacrifices I had made over the years. The times I skipped weekends away with friends because I had to help Dad fix a leaky pipe. The moments I passed on overtime at work to be available for Mom's doctor appointments. None of it seemed to have mattered. I wondered if Jacob ever did even a fraction of what I had done. Probably not. He was the golden child, the successful one. That was the word Mom used a lot. Successful. As if proximity, presence, and emotional labor counted for nothing unless they came with a six-figure salary. The bitterness started to simmer, but I kept it contained. I wasn't going to let this eat away at me. Instead, I started focusing on myself. I updated my budget, set money aside for a trip I'd been postponing for years, and spent more weekends doing things I enjoyed instead of running errands for someone else. It felt liberating, even if tinged with guilt at first. But guilt faded quickly when I reminded myself that it wasn't abandonment. It was balance. Then, exactly a month after that fateful conversation, I got the text. No greeting. No, how are you? Just, the mortgage is due. That was it. No context, no warmth. As if I were a bank or an app she could tap when needed. I stared at the message for a few minutes, half expecting a follow-up. But there was none. That was the moment it all crystallized for me. They didn't just leave me out of the will. They had relegated me to a role. I wasn't a son. I was a utility. A walking wallet. And now that I'd turned off the faucet, they were confused. I thought long and hard about how to respond. I knew whatever I wrote would mark a turning point, and I wanted it to be clear, measured, and honest. So I replied simply, "I'm no longer able to help with financial matters. You might want to reach out to Jacob." That was it. Polite, neutral, no emotion, but packed with finality. I stared at the message for a few moments before hitting send. I felt my heart thud in my chest, not from fear or anxiety, but from the gravity of choosing myself for once. The message was read almost instantly, but no reply came. I imagined her looking at it, stunned, maybe even indignant. Part of me braced for a flurry of angry texts or guilt-laced follow-ups, but there was nothing, just silence. It's strange how silence can say more than words ever could. That night I lay in bed replaying our history in my mind. I remembered the Christmas Jacob didn't come home and I stayed late helping Mom cook dinner. The time Dad fell and I rushed over, driving him to urgent care while Jacob was unreachable. So many moments, so many memories stacked like boxes in a storage unit no one cared to open. I guess what hurt most wasn't the omission in the will. It was the realization that my efforts were never truly seen, that I had been filling in the gaps without recognition, believing that family meant shared responsibility. Turns out, for them, it meant convenience. That night, I didn't sleep much, but I felt lighter than I had in months. I had drawn a boundary, something I was never good at. The next morning, I went for a long walk, letting the crisp air fill my lungs. For once, I didn't feel tethered to their needs. I didn't check my phone obsessively. I wasn't dreading the next ask. I was free, and the silence that followed wasn't empty. It was peaceful. It was the space I needed to breathe, to think, to rebuild, because I was done being the backup plan. Done being the son who gives everything and expects nothing. And if that made me the bad guy in their story, so be it. Days turned into weeks, and the silence persisted. Not a call, not a text, not even a passive-aggressive message forwarded from some family member. I didn't know whether they were too proud to respond or too shocked to process what I had said. Either way, I wasn't chasing them for answers. I focused on my own life, something I hadn't done properly in years. I started attending weekend art classes I'd always talked about. I reconnected with old friends, the kind of people who actually asked how I was doing without wanting something in return. The absence of obligation made room for presence. I could finally hear myself think. At work, my performance improved because I wasn't constantly distracted or mentally calculating how much I'd need to help my parents next. I even went on a short trip to the coast just to get away and reset. While walking on the beach one evening, barefoot in the sand, I realized something that almost brought me to tears. I didn't miss them. Not the way I thought I would. What I missed was the version of them I had built in my mind. The kind, supportive parents who valued fairness and saw me for who I was. That version never really existed. It was a comforting lie I told myself to justify years of sacrifice. The truth was more uncomfortable but also freeing. They chose Jacob not because he was better, but because he was easier to idealize. He lived far away, called once a month with updates, and never complicated their lives with inconvenient needs or opinions. I was there, in the trenches with them, and maybe that closeness made it easier to take me for granted. It's funny how proximity often leads to devaluation. The closer you are, the more invisible you become. But I wasn't invisible to myself anymore. I was waking up to my own worth, slowly and painfully, but surely. I didn't need a share of the estate to prove I mattered. What I needed was to stop waiting for validation from people who had already made their priorities clear. They wanted Jacob to handle things later. Fine, let him start now. A few more weeks passed, and life continued to improve in small but meaningful ways. I hadn't realized how much of my time had been spent managing their needs until I had that time back. Evenings were quieter, sure, but they were mine. I cooked for myself without rushing, read books I'd been putting off for years, and even started jogging again. One Saturday morning, while sipping coffee on my porch, I got a call from my aunt, Mom's sister. She never called randomly, so I answered with a bit of hesitation. "Hey," she said, "everything okay with you and your folks?" I played dumb at first, but she gently pressed. Apparently, Mom had called her crying about how I had cut them off and refused to help. My aunt sounded concerned, but also confused. "You've always been the one who helps out," she said. I explained everything, how I found out about the will, how they had left me nothing, and how I'd decided to step back. She was quiet for a while and then said, "I didn't know." That's really unfair. She didn't try to convince me to reconsider. She just said she understood, and that if I ever needed anything, she was there. That moment felt surprisingly validating. For years, I'd been the unsung helper, and now, at least someone in the family saw what was really happening. But the fact that my parents didn't even try to defend themselves with honesty, they just spun the story to make themselves victims, was telling. I realized then that they weren't just oblivious. They were manipulative. They didn't want a relationship. They wanted control. My silence disrupted their narrative. My refusal to comply turned me from loyal son to villain in their eyes. But I didn't care anymore. I was done living in a version of our family story where I was always the support character. I wasn't going to write myself out, but I was certainly not going to keep playing the fool. If they couldn't accept me as I was, equal, adult, autonomous, then maybe they never really knew me at all, and maybe I didn't need to know them anymore either. About 2 months after I stopped helping, I received another text from Mom. This one was a little longer but still cold and strangely transactional. "We're behind on utilities now. Is there any way you could just cover this month? Jacob said he's busy with work." That last line hit me like a slap, not because Jacob was unavailable, he always had an excuse, but because even now, after everything, they still thought I would say yes. They still believed I'd drop everything to rescue them while Jacob remained untouched, unbothered, and glorified. I didn't respond right away. I went for a walk instead, letting the wind cool my anger. I needed to be sure of myself, to not fall back into old habits. When I finally replied hours later, I kept it simple again. "I hope things work out, but I can't help. Please ask Jacob." No apologies, no explanations, just a clear boundary. The read receipt popped up, but again, no reply. I didn't expect one. What struck me, though, was how robotic these messages felt. There was no emotion, no warmth, no attempt to rebuild the bridge. They didn't ask how I was or even acknowledge my previous message. It wasn't about mending things, it was about maintenance. They weren't reaching out to connect. They were trying to patch holes in their budget using me as the filler. That realization was brutal. For a long time I had been afraid to pull away because I thought they needed me. But now I saw the truth. They only needed what I could give, not who I was. That distinction gave me a strange sense of closure. I wasn't abandoning them. I was removing myself from a role I was never truly appreciated in. I began writing a letter, not to send, but for myself. I poured everything into it. The years of unnoticed effort, the heartbreak of learning I didn't matter in their long-term plans, and the painful clarity that came with their continued indifference. It wasn't a letter of anger. It was a eulogy for the version of our relationship I once believed in. And as I finished the last line, I felt something shift inside me. Not bitterness, not rage, just release. With that emotional release, something inside me began to heal. I wasn't just letting go of their expectations. I was letting go of the pain that came from chasing approval that would never come. In that space, I started finding joy in new places. I joined a local hiking group, something I'd always wanted to do but never had the time or energy for. I met people who didn't know me as the dependable son or the family helper. They knew me for me, someone who loved nature, good conversation, and laughing around a campfire. It was refreshing. I also started therapy, which I had avoided for years thinking I didn't need it. But opening up to a stranger about the emotional dynamics of my family was one of the best decisions I ever made. My therapist helped me untangle the guilt I'd carried for years, the kind of guilt that was silently passed down through glances, sighs, and unspoken expectations. We talked about how emotional labor is often invisible, especially when you're the one always stepping up. She reminded me that setting boundaries isn't selfish, it's healthy. That taking care of yourself when others have consistently taken you for granted isn't betrayal, it's survival. I found myself walking through life with a bit more ease, a bit more confidence. I wasn't bitter anymore. I didn't replay old conversations or imagine dramatic confrontations. I just lived. And the more I lived, the more I realized how little space they'd left for me to grow before. Every time they called, it had been about something they needed. Never a check-in just to ask how I was doing. And now that I wasn't useful, they didn't know how to talk to me at all. I wasn't sure if they ever would. Part of me still hoped they might one day understand what they did, or at least acknowledge it. But I wasn't waiting on that anymore. I had spent too much of my life waiting. Now I was simply moving forward, one day at a time, without the weight of their approval dragging behind me like a shadow. Several months had passed when I heard from Jacob for the first time in nearly a year. He called out of the blue one evening, and I debated whether to pick up. Curiosity got the better of me. His voice was upbeat, almost rehearsed, like nothing had happened. "Hey, just checking in. Mom and Dad said you've been kind of distant." I let out a dry laugh and asked, "That's what they told you?" There was a pause. "Well, yeah," he said, uncertain. I decided to be direct. I told him about the will, about how I found out everything had been left to him, and how I stopped contributing because I realized I was being used. There was another long pause. "I didn't know they left me everything," he finally said. "They never told me that." I didn't know whether to believe him, but something in his voice sounded genuine. He went quiet, and then he said, "Man, I thought you were just mad at them for no reason." That statement landed hard. It confirmed just how little of my effort had been noticed or communicated. I asked him if he ever thought about why I was always the one handling things, why it was me driving them to appointments, fixing stuff around the house, or wiring money every time they fell behind. He didn't answer directly, just muttered, "I guess I figured you were just better at that kind of stuff." Better. Not more responsible, not more caring, just more convenient. That's what I'd been my whole life. Convenient. We ended the call civilly, but it left a strange taste in my mouth. It made me realize how deep the disconnect ran, not just with my parents, but with my brother too. None of them had really seen me for who I was, only for what I did. It wasn't anger I felt anymore. It was exhaustion. I had spent decades trying to prove my value through service, and now, standing outside of that dynamic, I could finally see how hollow it all was. I didn't hate them. I just didn't need them anymore. Not in the way I used to. Found out my parents left everything to my brother in their will, so I stopped helping with their bills and extra expenses. A month later, Mom texted me, "The mortgage is due." No greeting, no small talk. I simply replied. As fall arrived and the air turned crisp, I found myself reflecting more. Not out of sadness, but a growing sense of peace. There were still moments when I thought about my parents, especially when passing by places tied to old memories. A diner we used to go to, the hardware store where Dad and I used to shop for home repairs. But instead of stirring longing, those memories now felt like pages from a book I had closed. I didn't regret the years I helped them. I knew I did it from a place of love and responsibility. But I also acknowledged the imbalance, the way my loyalty had been met with silent expectation and, ultimately, disregard. I started thinking about legacy, not in terms of money or property, but in the emotional footprints we leave behind. My parents had chosen to leave a tangible legacy to Jacob, but emotionally, they left a void with me. And yet, I was filling that void in ways they never could, through friendships, passions, self-respect. I volunteered at a local shelter, something I had always wanted to do but never had the time for. Helping people who truly appreciated it was healing in a way I hadn't anticipated. I wasn't just giving, I was connecting, learning, growing. One afternoon after a shift, an older man at the shelter said to me, "You've got a good way about you. Quiet, but steady. That's rare." His words struck a chord. I realized that I didn't need validation from my family to feel whole. The world was full of people who could see value in me without needing me to prove it constantly. The burden I had carried for so long, of being the dependable one, the fix-it guy, the silent supporter, was no longer mine to bear. I was redefining myself on my own terms, and while my family might never understand or acknowledge the shift, I didn't need them to. I was finally learning how to exist without apologizing for my boundaries, without justifying my absence. I was no longer a character in their story. I was the author of my own. Winter settled in quietly, bringing with it a stillness I hadn't known in years. The holidays came and went without a single message from my parents. No invitation, no check-in, nothing. And while there was a faint ache from the absence, it was nothing like the old ache, the one that came from being near them and still feeling unseen. This was different. This was clean. I spent Christmas with friends who had become like family, people who laughed at my jokes, included me in their traditions, and hugged me like they meant it. There were no strings, no guilt, no hidden expectations, just genuine presence. I looked around the dinner table that night, at the warmth and the comfort, and I realized I wasn't missing out on anything. I hadn't lost a family. I had finally stopped pretending I ever had one that truly valued me. The future felt open in a way it never had before. I started planning a long trip for the coming year, somewhere I'd always wanted to go but never thought I could justify, because there was always some family emergency or bill or obligation holding me back. But now I was free. I didn't owe my time or energy to people who only saw me as a safety net. I owed it to myself to live a life I didn't constantly have to explain or defend. If my parents ever reached out again, I knew I'd be kind but firm. I wouldn't go back to who I was. That version of me had served his purpose and deserved to rest. I'd grown beyond the roles they assigned me. My worth was no longer up for debate. As the year ended, I stood outside under a sky thick with stars, letting the cold bite my cheeks while I breathed in the night air. I wasn't angry, and I wasn't waiting. I was simply present, finally living a life that belonged to me, no longer tethered to a version of family built on obligation. It was quiet, yes, but in that quiet, I had found my voice, and it was enough.